this month, as I have an opportunity to be with you this way. Wanted to talk a bit about church growth, patience, and hope. And I think that's a good theme for the Advent season, that from the darkness, light appears. It's a busy season. It tends to be the end of the year where we are scurrying about, not only for year-end giving, but so many things, that my prayer for you is that you wouldn't lose the moment in the midst of the mystery and the ministry of your own life. So I've been reading a book I'd like to talk about a little bit that has really surprised me. The book is by Alan Kreider, and it's called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. You know, I really do believe we are living in a moment and in a time that is most like the book of Acts than the church has experienced since the book of Acts. And as we think about, and we probably all taught about, the rise of the church, the growth of the church. And, there's a number of books that have been written on that topic. And a lot of different reasons have been given over the years from various scholars on why did the church grow so much, from how they deployed their ideas, which were radically different than the various cults that arose in the Greco-Roman Empire. Also, we saw that they championed their causes, that they cared for the widows, they cared for dropped off babies, that they served the poor in the midst of their own persecution. We also see there was growth by force, in a sense. And what I mean by force is supernatural force, that miracles, signs, and wonders followed the apostles' teachings and the teachings of the early church. A lot of books have been written on that. This book, particularly, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, goes in a little different direction. It really talks about, in those early years, it's hard to pinpoint why growth happened, where it happened. It was sporadic and it wasn't consistent, but it did happen. After Constantine the First, we all get it, right? After Constantine, the politics and religion were wed, not in a good way. We have actually been fighting against that ever since Constantine. What it did do well was it spread us through the Roman Empire and then to the ends of the world in very unique ways. Now, the growth prior to that was radically different. It wasn't, as we look, we didn't see evangelistic efforts, but we saw this other virtue at work. And I think that's why this book has just surprised me. And I am loving it, by the way. In the book, the author really points to three things. And, well, there's a fourth. But he talks about, in the early church, the primary virtue that they taught, the primary virtue that they believed was the chief virtue for them, was patience. That surprised me. I assumed love, something like that, but it was patience. And patience was the underpinning to the other things that the author says, these were the things that caused the early church to grow so much. And it was their habitus, their patient habits that they were forming. We might call that discipleship, as well as their catechesis and worship. The way they approached discipling, the way they approached educating those who were new believers in Jesus, and how that was supported by worship in the church. And then he talks about ferment, and where we get the word fermentation from, but there was this ferment underneath it all. But patience, interestingly enough, was the homily we see most in the early church teachings. I want to read you just a couple pieces out of this book that speak about that, because it gives me hope as we head into 2023 and even through this Advent season. Kreider writes this. He says, first, patience. Patience was not a virtue dear to most Greco-Roman people. and it has been of little interest to scholars of early Christianity, but it was centrally important to early Christians. They talked about patience and they wrote about it. It was their first virtue about which they wrote a treatise, and they wrote no fewer than 3 treatises on it. Christian writers called patience the highest virtue, the greatest of all virtues, the virtue that was peculiarly Christian. So it was uniquely Christian. The Christians believe that God is patience and that Jesus visibly embodied patience. And they concluded that they, trusting in God, should be patient, not controlling events, not anxious or in a hurry, and never using force to achieve their ends. This in a time when the church was under intense persecution from the government, real persecution from the government. They didn't see control as a way to bring about the ends of the gospel. Force was never the answer. Bearing up patiently was. And now patience then showed up in habitus, which is the second big idea in this book. Habitus or learning our reflexive bodily behaviors. How do we naturally respond to pressure, persecution, discouragement, disappointment? This is habitus. The sources rarely indicate that the early Christians grew in numbers because they won arguments. Note, we still aren't growing because we win arguments. Instead, they grew because their habitual behavior, rooted in patience, was distinctive and intriguing. Their habits, rooted in patient trust, were distinctive and intriguing. I like that. Their habitus, which is a term I have learned from French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, enabled them to address intractable problems that ordinary people faced in ways that offered hope. When challenged about their ideas, Christians pointed to their actions. They pointed to their behaviors. Wow. Their behavior said what they believed, and it was an enactment of their message. And the sources indicate that it was their habitus, more than their ideas, that appealed to the majority of the non-Christians who came to join them. Patience showing up in habitus, or I would really say habitus is discipleship, that we are beginning to live out the Christ life. We're learning how to live it out and become it and be transformed by the indwelling of Christ. Now he also will build in this book the concept of catechesis and worship. He notes that the early Christians were uncommonly committed to forming the habitus of their members. So they emphasized catechesis, which was careful formation and teaching in preparation for baptism. I like this, that their catechesis was careful formation and teaching. I would say in our culture in the West, careful formation and teaching, and the teaching of that is what we call discipleship. For them, discipleship was practicing and living out the habits of the careful catechesis. I think that's just important to note. Now, he goes on to say that all of this was in preparation for baptism. The Christians were vastly more serious about catechesis than were members of other religions of their time, and for good reason. They believed that impatient habits, unlike those of Jesus Christ, were deeply ingrained in the people who were raised in Greco-Roman societies. From experience, they knew that if people were to develop patient reflexes, they needed time, the friendship of mentors, and the opportunity to grow in patient ways of living that were normal for Christians. And after being shaped by catechesis, people who became Christians were baptized and then were sustained by the worship of Christian communities. Wow. That drew, that transformed, and that was a visible witness to all the people around them who didn't yet know Jesus. And then the last area he talks about was this ferment. I like what he says about ferment. He says, while they didn't write explicitly about ferment, you see it in everything. And author finds it as a useful metaphor to describe their patient growth and how it occurred. It operated reticently by what theologian Origen called God's invisible power. It was not susceptible to human control. Its pace could not be sped up. But in ferment, there was a bubbling energy, a bottom-up inner life that had immense potential. I like those words. A bottom-up power of the Holy Spirit slowly working his plan, his agenda, the new wine into this church, not controlled by a church growth movement, not controlled by anything other than the Spirit's direction in the church through patient trust. And now in this Advent season, why am I talking about the patient ferment of the early church? I believe our best days are ahead of us. I truly do. Our culture is more aligned with the church after the era of Constantine than we are with the Holy Spirit empowered supernatural dynamic of the first century church. However, the good news is our culture is most like today, the first century church. We've eclipsed postmodernism and we are post-Christian. I think the way we will win our neighbors who need Jesus more than ever is through patience. It's through allowing our natural habitus, our natural reflexive behaviors that have grown in patient surrender to the Holy Spirit to be eloquent witnesses of what Jesus has done, that his message would be given through us in the way we live and love our lives. I believe our culture is waiting for Christians not to try to control everything or to legislate everything, but to live a life that is intriguing and perplexing and beautiful and other. So I am hopeful that we have an opportunity in the moment that we are in to live differently, that our churches would look different, that we wouldn't be about a power grab, but we would be about a kingdom surrender and a transformed life that others would say, I need that in my own life. And you, my friend, are poised to do that. So this Advent season, when our world is in desperate need of hope, may you release your need to control. May you release your need to grow your church. And may you trust the supernatural ferment that is bubbling up as you lead your people into a deeper formation in Jesus. Leave the results up to him. Well, I love you. I appreciate you. And as always, I am praying for you. May this Christmas find you hopeful and healthy and excited for everything that Jesus is doing in you, through you, and around.